Hello and welcome to Radical Engagement here at Varn. And we continue our long slog, which we just began, through the mug reader for their selected text. Now, remember, there's also the blue book, which is Fight the Constitution for a Democratic Socialist Republic. That's not what we're covering, although I might cover some things from this. Also, you can read Cosmonaut magazine for Cosmonaut, which is where this tendency sort of comes from. And you can read Light and Air if you want to read Mug's regular articles. And that's all the plugging for Marxist Unity Group. People might think I'm in it, which I'm not yet. All right. So we ended on these discussion questions. Describe the merger formula and its place in the history of social democracy. Describe the components of Erfurtinianism. So the Erfurt program. Describe the components of the Erfurt program. I would just say that. That's way easier of a word to say. Describe Lih's circle of awareness. Is this schema applicable to contemporary socialist movement? What is the good news conception of social democracy? Why is social democracy needed, and why it would be heeded by the working class? Why is political freedom light and air for the workers' movement? What's the history of the light and air metaphor? Why did the Russian Social Democrats describe it? And Lih doesn't mention the demand for a democratic republic in the opening chapter. Why might this be the case? Can Lih's conclusions be taken as definitive? Now, who is Lars Lih? This is going to be reading from Lenin Rediscovered What Is to Be Done, which is a massive tome released in 2006 by Brill/Haymarket. Sort of got Lenin studies on the map. Lars Lih is a Canadian academic, actually primarily, I believe, in musicology, like my friend Stefan Hamill, also a Marxist musicologist. But before you say, oh, why does it mean he writes in Soviet things? I think his specialist was actually Russian opera, which means that he has a command of the language. Lih is someone who I don't always agree with. I know him for 3 books primarily. Bread and Authority in Russia, 1914-1921, which is his book, I believe, which a lot of it covers the Russian Civil War. Lenin Rediscovered, this is the first chapter of, and highly influential on the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee, aka Magnier and those guys, Ben Lewis, etc., over there in the UK. And it was highly influential on Donald Parkinson and a lot of the early founders of Cosmonaut. And there's a lot of like Russianist I know or Sovietist I know who actually say it's a very good book. So don't hold it against him that Lih was writing slightly out of field. I also know him for a biography of Lenin, which I think is factually fine, but omits the stuff during the Civil War, which I found a little bit questionable as a decision in a biography. Because the Red Terror and the Civil War are pretty important things for getting where Lenin's lines were. But anyway, let's go back to Lars Lih. So this is from section 1, the merger formula section, and this is going to be a large part, I think maybe the whole thing, of chapter 1 of Lenin Rediscovered What Is to Be Done. Now, I have that book somewhere around here, the whole thing. I've read it before. It's been a long time, so this is almost like a fresh read for me. I've always joked that I have Lars Lih and Hal Draper fist fighting in my head about how I should interpret Lenin. All right. Anyway, anyone reading Lenin's early writings will often run across the formula: social democracy is the merger of socialism and the workers' movement. At one point, he describes this formula as Karl Kautsky's expression that reproduces the basic ideas of the Communist Manifesto. In this way, Lenin draws a link between what, for him, were the 2 foundational books: the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels and the Erfurt Program by Karl Kautsky. So important were these 2 books to the young Lenin that he translated both of them into Russian. Unfortunately, now their translation survives. I would really love to know. I mean, it would be weird to translate a Russian translation of a German translation into English, but sometimes it actually is important for us to get the differences in how these translation schemas went. Like, what decisions did Lenin make when translating from the German? Anyway, that's just an interesting thing because sometimes it explains more the differences between different regional sections of different religions or different political movements if you know how they interpreted the key text in translation. All right, we shall follow Lenin's lead and describe the developments from the 1840s to the 1890s with the merger formula as a unifying theme. The same is not so much as to advance a particular interpretation of the history of the 19th century Marxist socialism as to bring out how Lenin and others of his generation saw this history. I mean, I think even if you're just trying to recontextualize what Lenin thought himself, that involves interpretive lenses because we're remodeling what Lenin thought. But I more or less think Lih is doing what he says here. The merger formula is a condensation of a narrative. A key to the considerable emotional charge of this narrative is the idea of mission. See, we already have an interpretive framework. Both the world historical mission of the workers to take power and introduce socialism, according to Marx anyway, and the mission of the Social Democrats to merge socialism with the workers' movement, to get all those intellectuals to actually line up with the workers. To bring this emotional aspect out, I shall be quoting some flowery rhetoric of a type that does not often make its way into secondary accounts. Anyone who pictures social democracy as based on dry and deterministic scientific socialism, it was based on scientific socialism, but it wasn't dry or deterministic, and overlooks the fevered rhetoric of the good news and saving missions has missed the point. I mean, this is why they pointed this out in the discussion questions. Now, I've already told you how I feel about discussion questions. Maybe I haven't because maybe you didn't watch the first video. As an English teacher, I'm always torn about them because they direct your reading. But I do think it's interesting that scientific socialism and the good news, and clearly a reference to the Gospels, right? There's an evangelical zeal to early communism. And duh. But it is interesting when you read later Soviet documents, particularly those of the late 40s and 50s, and God forbid you get into Soviet documents in the 70s. They do often read serial instructions. Okay. The merger formula also implied a concrete political strategy that is often overlooked as the formula's emotional fervor. In order to further understand the desired merger, certain kinds of organizations need to be set up, certain kinds of political conditions need to be established, and certain social forces need to be assessed as either friends or foes. When the Russian Social Democrats put forth this strategy, observers found it innovative and even heretical. Heretical to what? What are the observers' biases in which we're finding them heretical? Anyway, sorry, that's a rhetorical, and it's a writing flourish. There's nothing wrong with it. I just always wonder, okay, who found it heretical? Was it other Marxists? What we're doing here? The Russians may have come up with a new name of hegemony. The basic logic had been fairly thoroughly worked out by the Germans. My label of good news interpretation underscores the two vital but underappreciated aspects of the 19th century social democracy. The proselytizing fever of the Social Democrats plus the hard-headed thinking about how best to spread the word. Marx and Engels. Quote, one of the success of the workers possesses numbers, but numbers weigh only in the balance, if united by combination and led by knowledge. Karl Marx, Inaugural Ideas, 1864. Now, I mentioned that Marx thought that the advanced sectors of the proletariat needed to merge with the socialists so that they could jointly educate the rest of the movement. Although advanced is one of those weasel words in later socialist theories that everyone parts over. What did Marx mean by advanced? The most knowledgeable technical workers, the most politically adroit, the most devoted to the cause, the most oppressed, as I said, the Marxist humanists often interpret. You pick, advanced is kind of vague, but that's what he meant, or what he laid out, excuse me. And this is consistent in both his writing and in the addresses that he gave to various different groups. So let's get here. At its height, the merger narrative is a world historical epic about the coming of socialism. In its full scope, the epic surveils both, quote, the history of hitherto existing societies and the future. Because the history of hitherto existing societies is class struggle. Although, as many people have noted, and I think somewhat fairly, Marx is a little flexible in what class struggle is, how metaphorical or indirect that it is. In a biographical sketch Marx written during his lifetime, Engels summarizes the crucial final episodes of this epic in one monster sentence. Oh boy, it is a monster sentence. With massive brackets at that. Marx's new conception of history teaches that, bracketed, so not in the original text, the ruling big bourgeoisie have fulfilled a historic calling. God, I hate when they just randomly put German words back in there. Beruf. That it is no longer capable of the leadership of society and has even become a hindrance to the development of production. I mean, if it was in 1850 then or 1870, then you can imagine how this is. That historical leadership, Leitung, has passed through the proletariat, a class which, owing to its own position in society, can only free itself by abolishing altogether all class rule, all servitude and all exploitation, and the productive forces of society which have overgrown the control of the bourgeoisie and are only waiting for the associated proletariat to take possession of them in order to bring about a state of things in which every member of society will be enabled to participate not only in production but also in the distribution and administration of social wealth. Oh boy, so yes, production is the most important part, but distribution administration also a part of it, which also increases the productive forces of society and their yield by planned operation of the whole of production of the satisfaction of all reasonable needs, which will be assured to everyone in ever increasing measure. Good old historical optimism there. That's a very German sentence. Just want to point that out. Moving on. For those of you who haven't read a lot of German, I've hit some sentences that are pages long. All right. While this particular formulation brings out the key feature of Marxist narrative, classes have a calling for historical leadership. It does not bring out the central task of the proletarian class leadership, namely the conquest of political power, so that they can implement an economic program and thus change all cultural and social barriers. I'm adding the latter part, but that's why you want political power. It's not just that, change who runs the system. It was to totally change the system itself. The Communist Manifesto states this task as follows, quote, the immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties, the formation of a proletariat into the class, the overthrow of bourgeoisie rule, the conquest of political power by the proletariat. Yeah, true. Although ultimately Marx is for the abolition of the proletariat as a class and the abolition of all classes. That last part's important. That's not just an ultra left point. All right. Anyway, Marx's inaugural address in 1864 for the Working Men's International Association put it more succinctly. To conquer political power has therefore to become the great duty of the working class. All right. I always have to check these things, so let's actually look up what the manifesto says right by this point. Lih is actually pretty good at documenting stuff, so I'm not going to question him that he knows what he's talking about. I just want to see what's around that quote. Because if I remember correctly, it's from chapter 2 of the manifesto. And it is. Okay, good. I'm going to read the whole thing. Okay, maybe not the whole thing. Well, let's read most of it. In what relations do the communists stand to the proletariat as a whole? And for those of you who don't know, I'm reading chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists, which is probably where the merger formula really comes from, first stated. The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. This is also where the United Front comes in. Well, can you come back to that? Not maybe today. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. We failed at that. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. One, the national struggle of the proletariat of different countries. They point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. So we organize nationally because that's where the proletariat is, but we align people internationally so that the nationalities can't divide people apart. I don't know why this is so hard for people, but it's really hard for people. Anyway, back to Communist Manifesto. Let me share that screen actually so you guys can see it. Let's see. Stop screen share of the Lars Lih. Let's screen share the Communist Manifesto Chapter 2. We'll go back to Lars Lih, don't worry. Two, in the various stages of development in which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, stages, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So the communists are aligned with the whole movement, not just particular movements, not just particular nationalities, and not just particular sectors of the class, like the blue collar part, or the white collar part, or the PMC parts, really just white collar parts if they're actually wage earners. All right. The communists, therefore, are on one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class of every parties of every country. The section which pushes forward all the others, and on the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So we have to understand the proletarian scientifically. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Just all workers' parties would be the way to understand this. The formation of the proletariat into a class, the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, the contrast of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would be universal reformer. Well, we're Marxist. That is, yeah. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from the historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. So it's already been there. Other people have called for the abolition of property. All property relations in the past have been continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon which the change in historical conditions, which the French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property, a productive property. But the modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonism, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up into a single sentence: the abolition of private property. Private property being bourgeois property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as a fruit of man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedoms, activity, and independence. See Hegel, for who thought that. See the philosophy of right. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you not mean the property of petty artisan and the small peasant, a form of property that has preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is destroying it daily. Yeah, we don't need to take your petty artisan stuff because you can't compete in the market anyway. Kind of true, particularly now. I mean, it wasn't actually all that true when this was written, but it's true now. But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., the kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon the condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To the capitalist, it is to have not only a purely personal, but also a social status in production. Capital is a collective product. And only by united action of its many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united actions of all the members of society can it be set in motion. People have to be producers, consumers, blah, 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 blah. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. Yeah, money is power, capital is power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is thereby not transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that has changed. It loses its class character. We could go on for a while about what that means, but it's important. Now let us take the wage laborer. The average price of the wage laborer is the minimum wage, i.e., the quantum of the means of subsistence, which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish the personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. If you make shit, it's yours, man. Although, as we see in the Peaking Earth program, that's not entirely true for social labor. But if, like, you do something on your own time, who cares if you have it? All we want to do is do away with the miserable character of its appropriation, under which the laborer lives, not merely to increase capital. It is allowed to live only insofar as the interests of the ruling class require it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but the means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, and promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And so on and so on. There's a lot more of this, but I just want to check and make sure that the merger formula is actually there. I've gotten very, very cautious about checking how people selectively cite Marx. I think Lih checks out. That's simple. I mean, I do think the merger formula is implied here. And beyond that, the merger formula is key to understanding what's at stake. Now, there's a little bit of the rhetoric that almost seems paradoxical. The communist has no singular reformer. The communist has no, set reforms, but we are here for the abolition of property, and this is what that means. Blah 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 blah. All right, let's go back to Lih here, because we're only about a page in, and I've already taken 20 minutes, 10 of which involved me going into a digression about the main text of the Communist Manifesto. All right. Marx's inaugural address in 1864 for the Workingmen's International Association, the First International, put it more succinctly: to conquer political power has therefore become the great duty of the working class. Scientific socialism is a reasoned reaccounting of this world historical epoch. We are here primarily interested in the political strategy that differentiates Marx-based social democracy from other 19th century socialists and revolutionaries, like the Narodniks, or the Chartists, or the Blanquists, or the Proudhonists, or the Levelers, or the Nihilists in Russia. I mean, yeah, they were too. There's lots of groups. The Narodniki. Thus, we now focus on one particular episode from the overall story, namely the episode in which the worker class realizes its great duty and carries it out. As long as we remain on the level of the world historical epoch as a whole, we can content ourselves by saying, quote, the worker class realizes its great duty. As if this process occurs more or less automatically. Yeah, I don't think it does. If you look around, if it automatically happened, weird things are weird. But once we start to examine this episode in detail, we immediately see that the episode has a dramatic plot of its own, since it describes the outcome of the interaction of historical actors who strive to overcome obstacles to their chosen goal. The plot of this is summarized by the merger formula. Social democracy is the merger of socialism and the worker movement. Socialism here means socialist doctrine. And social democracy is a historical actor that has prepared the working class for its great deed. So I'm going to have to break this down the way I think about these things. One, socialism here is a doctrine of socialism, which is the abolition of private property. Social democracy is a historical actor, aka a democratically run party that can act as an agent instead of just an aggregate. So think about the for itself and in itself distinctions. Social democracy is one of the ways in which socialism as a doctrine can find people to act together in an organized way, which gives the collective some kind of historical force. And that's got to merge with a larger collective, which is the working class for itself. To use classical Marx jargon. That jargon is important to understand, though, because once you understand the NFL for self distinctions and the collective and aggregate and agentic and all these things, not words that would have been used, not words that are used in a lot of dialectics today, but it will help you understand what is at stake here. According to both Kautsky and Lenin, the first person to set forth the logic of the merger narrative was Engels and the Conditions of the Working Class in England, published in 1845. In tribute to Engels, written after his death in 1895, Kautsky summarized the argument of this book in these words: the worker movement must be the power to bring socialism into birth. Socialism must be the goal of the worker movement sets before itself. In his own tribute to the recently deceased Engels, Lenin closely followed Kautsky in giving the high evaluation to the conditions of the working class. This book shows that Engels was, quote, the first to say that the proletariat is not only a suffering class. Now, we need to remind ourselves what the proletariat is. Proletariat means propertyless. It's a category from ancient Rome for those who could not really participate in the system because they did not have the property to buy weapons to participate in war, or so that they only could give their physical persons or their children as conscripts. It's used by Marx to indicate people who work but who do not have property. But remember, property here is not just like you don't own a house or anything like that. It's that you don't have productive property. You don't have the means of reproducing yourself economically. All right. Lenin also summarized Engels' argument. Quote, all that the socialists had to understand was which social force, owing to its position in contemporary society, had the deep interest in the realization of socialism, and then communicate that force and awareness of its interest in historical tasks. The proletariat is such a social force. The political movement of the working class inevitably leads the workers to the awareness that there is no escape outside of socialism. I mean, hopefully, it inevitably leads them. That might be a little bit optimistic, Eagles. On the other hand, socialism only becomes a force when it becomes the aim of the political struggle of the working class. So it doesn't really matter until someone can manifest it. All right. Engels' argument is set forth in the chapter of the condition of the working class entitled "The Workers' Movement." In it, Engels delineates two separate forces. The first is the worker movement that achieved its highest expression in Chartism, a radical political movement on the national scale. The second is the socialist agitation inspired by Robert Owen. The socialists are, quote, thoroughly tame and peaceable. They understand, it is true, why the working man is resentful against the bourgeois, but regard as unfruitful this class hatred, which, after all, the only moral incentive by which the worker can be brought nearer to the goal. And so, in its present form, socialism can never become the common creed of the working class. It must condescend to return for a movement to the Chartist standpoint. Engels confidently outlines the next episode in the story and what is evidently the first explicit statement of the merger narrative. Quote, it is evident that the worker movement is divided into two sections, the Chartists and the Socialists. The Chartists are more backwards, less developed, but they are genuine proletariat all over, the representatives of their class. The socialists are more far-seeing, propose practical remedies against distress, but proceeding originally from the bourgeoisie, mostly the lower bourgeoisie, and are for this reason unable to amalgamate completely with the working class. The merger, Versmettelung, I think. Man, my German is really degraded. My German teachers from when I lived in Germany 2 decades ago are probably rolling their eyes. Anyway, of socialism and Chartism, the reproduction of the French communism in the English style will be the next step and has already begun. Then only when this has been achieved will the worker class be the true leader of England. Meanwhile, political and social development will proceed and will foster this new party, this new departure of Chartism. I've quoted Kautsky's and Lenin's summary of Engels in order to bring out the crucial importance of this chapter for both men. They saw it as a first statement of the essence of their political creed, and yet it is well nigh impossible to find any mention of this chapter in the secondary literature. Thus, the view from what had to be done implied a revised Marxist canon. The logic of the merger narrative is deeply embedded in the Communist Manifesto, or, in any event, Lenin strongly believed this to be the case. Reading it there, it seems to be the case. I'm just going to agree with Lih and apparently Lenin that it is. The Communist Manifesto states that the communists, quote, fight, kämpfen, for the attainment of those aims and interests of the working class that lie immediately to hand, but they are also the voice in the present movement of the future of the movement. This sentence expresses specifically the Marxist roadmap to socialism, merging day-to-day interests that give rise to the workers' movement with the final aim of socialism. It was precisely the roadmap, and perhaps this very sentence, that finally persuaded Georgy Plekhanov, the most important founder of Russian social democracy, to become a Marxist in the early 1880s. It is not too fanciful to see the merger formula reflected all over the structure of the manifesto. The manifesto is divided into 3 large sections: bourgeois and proletariat, proletarian communist, socialist, and communist literature. The first section, the bourgeois and proletariat, tells the story of the workers' movement up to the point of revolution in very abstract terms, but it's really beautiful. I was it's about 13 years ago, and I was in Guangzhou Airport in China, flying back home to see my family on vacation when I was working at a university in the Republic of Korea. And I thought it would be really fun to just find a cheap LibVox podcast version of the manifesto just to refresh myself and listen to the whole thing in an airport in Guangzhou, which I did because I got stuck there. I also found some interesting things that led to poems like Tonkas of Mao, which was kind of strange. If you don't know what that is, that's a kind of religious painting, but instead of a Buddha, they had Mao's face. Such is the life of a international school teacher about 12 years ago, one who happened to have been becoming a communist for about 7 or 8 years at that point. But I remember loving listening to that first section of the Communist Manifesto, because the manifesto is not the most important document in my understanding of Marx. The most important documents are Capitals Volume 1 and 2 and 3. And then the critique of the Gotha program. But anyway, but I think some of the most beautiful writing is actually in bourgeois and proletarian section of the manifesto. The basic theme of this section is the resistance of the workers in the growing organization. That is, the replacement of the mutual isolation through competition by merger. Feiringun. Fuck that word. I didn't say it right. Of the workers in the revolutionary associations. The next section, Proletarian and Communist, describes the aims of the revolution. That is, the future of the movement, not the furtherance of the movement. Man, my face is kicking in bad today. The Communist is said to reflect only the beliefs that the most decisive part of the workers' movement, the one that will ever drive it forward. I'm skipping that part. I also don't understand why they just randomly put sections of it in German in there. Like, if you're going to do that, it would be better to do front facing like we do in literature. Have it in German on a different page, or you have it in English. Just putting random sections of the German in there where there are terms that have multiple meanings can be itself a little bit weird. Now, in a citation like this that Lee's doing, I get why you put this in there, but it's a little bit frustrating. Thus, the workers' movement as a whole still needs to be persuaded of its great duty. That's der insneidensa immer wieder treibende Teller. Tell, not tella. There's no E there. Tella. Tell. Der insneidensa immer wieder treibende Tell. Thus, the workers' movement as a whole still needs to be persuaded of its great duty. What the communists need to do is to get the workers to actually, do the thing. So we see the first section describes the workers' movement, and the second section describes socialism. The third section turns to the question of how to merge the two. This section of socialist and communist literature is where the political strategy inherent in the merger formula begins to be worked out. Marx invites us to observe the self-destruction of all forms of socialism except the kind that reaches out to the workers' movement. So Fordites and Owenites and Fourierists and all kinds of people who, there's a lot of socialists before we get to Marx people, and I think not just the anarchist ones. There's Fourierism was very popular in America at one point. Saint-Simonism was popular here. There were all kinds of utopian communes. Transcendentalist communes were pretty common. If you've ever read Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance, it's about one. They were not Marxists, but they were socialists. Marx invites us to observe the self-destruction of all other forms of socialism except the kind that reaches out to the workers' movement. The aggressively polemical tone is, in one way, it's complement to the socialists. Marx wants to persuade other socialists that their duty is to further this process, that they are an aware element. They are the ones who need to be directly convinced by abstract reasoning and literary polemics. When socialists have been swung around, they themselves will start spreading the awareness in the workers' milieu. The 5 targets subjected to the critique in the final section of the manifesto are not just random assortments, but represent the most logical possibilities of opposition to the merger strategy. As such, they foreshadow the bulk of the polemics unleashed by social democracy against its competitors. The first target is feudal or reactionary socialists. Those who are socialists because they like communal living or lords or some shit. The merger strategy will not work here because these are the wrong socialists. Their demagogic flirting with the workers covers up the will to dominate the workers' movement. Various forms of state socialism continue to challenge social democracy throughout the 19th century. Now, this is interesting. What do we mean by state socialism? German historical school socialists are often linked here. And his next target, petty bourgeois socialist, Marx argues the merger strategy will fail because it is based on the wrong workers. The interests of the petty bourgeoisie, peasants and shopkeepers, this is aimed at Proudhonists, basically, not lead them towards a viable socialist strategy, but towards a reactionary utopia in which economic independence is based on individual property, like mutualism and shit. All right. The third target, through socialist, will be examined later when we look at the manifesto's tactical implications. Its fourth and fifth targets, we see the right workers and the right socialists, but outside the merger, outside the great synthesis. If the workers' movement refuses to adopt the revolutionary socialist point of view, it becomes bourgeois reformism. Cough, cough. Most socialism today is that vainly seeks to emancipate workers inside the framework of bourgeois society, aka have a better life. This isn't inherently bad, guys. As I said, I would love if reformists were actually reformist. If the socialists continue to regard the workers as incapable of emancipating themselves, they will dwindle in their sets of cranks. Cough, 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 cough. But this is also aimed at Fourierists and Orwellites and those people, people of Blithedale Romance, people who go off and form voluntary communes, but do not try to liberate or change society fundamentally. The United Commune. There's all kinds of them. Many were started in the 70s and many were started in the 1870s. So you want to read the history of American communes, there's plenty out there. The manifesto does not blame the early workers' movement and the early socialists for not immediately seeking the merger. Indeed, they are praised for their embattled resistance on one hand and for their critical insight on the other. It is a continued great refusal, a refusal of the great synthesis that is reprehensible. Like, the early socialists couldn't have known better, but we have history, so we do. Having established the foundational impact of the merger narrative, we now turn to the outline of political strategy therein implied, set forth in various remarks by the masters. I wouldn't. Maybe that is just leftover from musicological writing. I don't refer to anyone as masters. The first key idea is the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class themselves. This is a famous motto of the First International, which can be understood in two ways. On one reading, the motto tells revolutionaries from the other classes that they are not wanted. The emancipation of the workers is the business of the workers and no one else. The motto was understood this way by the French Proudhonists, who were perhaps the most important constituency within the First International, and Marx probably thought the most annoying until the Bakuninite came around. On another reading, the motto not only refuses to close the door to non-proletarian revolutionaries, but actually invites them in. And by the way, it's explicit in proletarianization section of the Communist Manifesto, which is not its own section, but it's a section within it. You should read it. It's really important. All right. On the other, the motto not only refuses to close the door on the non-proletarian revolutions, but actively invites them in. If only the workers themselves can bring about their revolution, then it is imperative that they come to understand what they need to do, and that they obtain the requisite organizational tools. The mission of preparing the working class for its mission was incumbent upon any socialist who accepts the Marxist class narrative, no matter what his or her social origin. We don't need everyone to be of their class. The Proudhonists ironically had included the petty bourgeois and pretty much anyone who did physical labor in their idea of who was the working class. Marxists didn't, but it's not important that you are of the working class to be a socialist. It is important that the workers class, the working class interest dominate the program of whatever comes out of that situation. So that's the distinction. You subordinate yourself to the working class because the working class is the only class that can abolish all classes by enabling everyone to learn the means of their own reproduction, social reproduction. Everyone has the means of their own reproduction. That's what sex is for. But no, it's not the only thing that sex is for. I don't want to sound like a reactionary. It's one of the many things sex is for. But the social reproduction and reproduction of your economy, when you have no interest in the current scenario, can be universalized. And people who throw their lot in with that class, they choose to proletarianize themselves. There's two ways to be proletarianized. One is your class can fall into proletarian conditions. That's one form of proletarianization. AKA, you can move from a professional who is a petty bourgeois to a professional who is a wage earner to someone who has to do physical labor. Right? That is a kind of proletarianization. The other kind of proletarianization is to choose to throw your lot in with the working class without letting your general class interests dominate the political program. And that's a very fine line. But when you hear Marxists act like only working class people can be a part of this, that's not what most Marxists have thought. That's what Proudhonists thought, but they even had a different definition of what class was. Anyway, as the program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party put in 1890, the aim of social democracy is to organize the proletariat politically, to fill it with the awareness of its position and task, and then make and keep it spiritually and physically fit for the struggle. I'm not going to read the German parts because you guys have watched me butcher German since I'm quickly losing the pronunciation of it, and I'm losing my voice. It follows that the job of socialists is to ensure that workers are, quote, united by a combination led by knowledge. Combination, disciplined organization is necessary on both the national and international level. That's why you need both parties and internationals. We don't have an international right now, not a big one. If the workers are not to be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent effort, as Marx elegantly put it in the inaugural address. When Marx and Engels speak of the knowledge that must lead the workers, they mean, of course, the scientific socialism. A critical example of this by Engels defines scientific socialism in the social democratic political strategy. These sentences conclude the immensely influential and very good book, Socialism, Utopian Scientific. I despair of reproducing the rhetorical force made by the German syntax, and therefore present the passages in both language, and I'm going to spare you me butchering the German parts. To carry out this world-freeing deed, oh, it does read better in German. But anyway, to carry out this world-freeing deed, this is a historical calling of the modern proletariat. The task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism, is to solidly exploit the deed's historical conditions and therefore its very nature. And by doing so, scientific socialism will bring about the conditions and nature of its proletarian zone, acting to the awareness of the class that, although oppressed today, is called to this great action. Beruf, calling, is an expressive, intense word that summons up echoes of highly religious calling. Like, it's like a calling. If you've ever hung around evangelicals, the way they talk about everything as a calling, like they chose a career because it was a calling. This is the same thing. All right. If you haven't hung around evangelicals, and a lot of you are secular kids, maybe maybe you still understand a calling. My profession, I profess to be that. Right? The proletariat is almost defined as der zur Action Berufsklasse, the so-called great deed class. Scientific socialism on task, Aufgabe. Another keyword is not to explicate the proletariat, calling it, but also to make it a class, to make the class aware of it. That is, to get involved in the nuts and bolts of propaganda and agitation, to form the thing from in itself a sociological construct and aggregate to for itself. Now, I want to point out that you can't really separate the for itself and in itself totally. A lot of people try to. Don't do that. That is to get involved in the nuts and bolts of propaganda and agitation. Thus, scientific socialism tells the proletariat a story about itself, its past historical conditions, its present oppressed, and its future world-freeing deed. Since the world will itself inspire the proletariat to carry out this great deed, telling a story is a precondition for freeing the world. Thus, we have socialist newspapers, and many Maoist and Trotskyist traditions thus begin. And also shit posting on whatever social media you're doing. Never mind. You get the point, though. That actually is part of maybe what we might call the Scientific Socialist Great Commission. All right. There's a lot more to this, and I'm running out of my voice. We've been going for about 50 minutes, so I'm going to end this here. And again, you can find this for free on the internet. I talked about why I'm doing this in the first one, so if you want to know what that, go back and listen to the first one. I think I'm going to be doing other articles too, although not this week, just because I've been sick. You can hear it in my voice. I have a rasp today. And maybe that makes me a little bit cooler sounding because I normally sound a little bit like a teddy bear. And on that, protect your peace, keep reading, keep studying, and work for a better tomorrow. Take care. Oh yeah, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's a Patreon. You can find us at Varn at Patreon, and you can join for as little as $4. There's also a free podcast, but it just has the interviews. And you should go back to the beginning and find out where to find mug-related materials, such as Cosmonaut Magazine, which is not run by Mug. It is a separate project, but the two projects are related. Light and Air, which is run by Mug, and there's the Mug Blue Book, which was published by Cosmonaut Press, and there is this reader, which is available for free on the Marxist Unity Group's website. And maybe there's a mug somewhere. Take care.